So we're moving into the last part of the Subjection of Women, chapter 4. And here he's going to address the concern that, more or less, that chivalry is dead. That if we move in this direction, this great tradition and this sort of humanizing tradition will be destroyed. And so he gives a good look at chivalry, okay? First thing he says is, in the past, and this is a part of chivalry, women were seen as sort of the moral paragons and the guardian of religion. And kind of, I mean, at least ideally, obviously, I always say that because in reality, of course, these things vary greatly from person to person, but ideally they were sort of held up on a pedestal. They were not supposed to get involved in the nitty-gritty, difficult work because they had this role to play in preserving morality and religion and caring for the household and that kind of thing, okay? So men were ideally supposed to respect women for that role and kind of protect them so they could fulfill that role and have that, as he says, softening influence on society, okay? So they were seen as weaker, and they are weaker physically, and I don't think Mill anywhere disputes that, but they were seen as weaker and therefore needing protection. And because they needed protection, that brought out supposedly the best in men, to be gentle towards them, to be courteous, to be polite, to also be ready to protect them and society in any way they could. And so among the virtues that women brought out in men was not only the so-called gentlemanly virtues, but also the military virtues, because of this, this desire to make sure that women were protected and admired. And back in the past, women actively encouraged the martial virtues through, rewarding men with their admiration for their performance in tournaments and on the battlefield and so forth. So, critics of this new approach said, well, what will happen to these motivations? And what will happen to society if we don't have these motivations in men? And that's a legitimate question now, because men can be a very positive force in society, or they can be a very negative force. They tend to go either way. President Obama made a speech a couple of days ago now on the My Brother's Keeper initiative. That I guess it's been around for a year, but it was the first time I heard of it, because he pointed out that for the most part the news coverage wants to cover the dramatic riots and violence and so forth, but they don't want to cover the more positive steps that people are trying to take to do something about it. But one of the things that he did in this speech is specifically say young men, and specifically young men of color, but young men also generally need to know that they're respected, that we care about them, that there's some sort of positive thing that they can do, get an education, further themselves, because young men can be particularly a more destructive force in society, or they can be a very positive force in society. So this old-fashioned ethic of chivalry could be seen as a mechanism, a cultural mechanism for keeping in check those destructive tendencies and kind of channeling them in a positive direction. So, a legitimate concern. Obviously, President Obama is not going to talk about chivalry, but it's the same sort of motivation here. We need to make sure they know how important they are, that they're responsible, and they need to act responsibly towards others. He says on page 696, over on the right-hand column towards the middle, from the combination of the two kinds of moral influence exercised by women arose the spirit of chivalry, the peculiarity of which is to aim at combining the highest standard of the warlike qualities with the cultivation of a totally different class of virtues, those of gentleness, generosity, and self-abnegation or self-denial, toward the non-military and defenseless classes generally, and a special submission and worship directed toward women who were distinguished from the other defenseless classes by the high rewards which they had it in their power voluntarily to bestow on those who endeavored to earn their favor instead of extorting their subjection. Okay, so that kind of says it all there. The military virtues are harnessed by this, gentler aspect of respect for weaker people, and particularly for women, giving men the incentive to behave with responsibility with this, the aggressiveness. Okay? So he's dealing with something very controversial here. Even at this time in the 19th century, chivalry was still a big deal. It had sort of become more about the gentlemanly aspect and less about the warlike aspect, but still that was there as well. And men would have thought that the end of that, as Edmund Burke said a little bit earlier in the 18th century, was sort of the death knell of civilization itself. Because what will happen is men will take advantage, and they will run rampant, and they will do whatever they want, and you'll have this breakdown of moral authority. So Burke was sure with the French Revolution that this had come to an end because of the way men were behaving, the way women were behaving during the French Revolution. Okay, so Mill's response is not going to be terribly comforting to people who want to uphold some kind of chivalry, okay? Because he says we can't count on chivalry enough of the time, that women can't count on it, which is why I said ideally to begin with, right? Because for every man who behaves in a very chivalric fashion and is totally responsible, you have another man who is not doing that. And in any case, should women enter into, say, the contract of marriage the way it is at that time, when they had to basically give up all of their power on the hopes that their husband will be chivalrous and will continue to be chivalrous and isn't just faking it when he's courting her, okay, which is something that I'm sure happened and still does happen, right? I mean, people change sometimes, and you hear this complaint all the time. Oh, she acted a certain way before we got married, and now it's different, okay? So people do that. So do you want to take that chance, in other words? Mill says, no, that's asking too much from women to put all their hopes on the voluntary kindness and generosity of men.
But I feel like he could have gone in a kind of different direction with that, because so he goes from, like, this is, like, it's a big question, where do you get morality from if you don't get it from religion? Well, it's really unpopular to say, like, chivalry today. Like,
yeah.
It has kind of the opposite kind of a
like sexism.
Controversy, yeah. But if he said, well, no, this isn't, like, he can continue with his argument, like, we shouldn't be holding women this account, like, to expect this, but men could still do to, draw morality from it.
Right, yeah. In other words, do both, right? To have both legal protection, but still expect men to adhere to these higher standards because of their difference in strength as well as probably aggressiveness, right? I mean, he could have done that. I think that is part of what makes this so controversial, is that he really does come down. Now, I'm sure he would not want men to be unchivalrous or ungentlemanly, but he really comes down on, we need to have legal protections, and that is a substitute for the moral motivations, okay? So on 297, middle of the left-hand column, he says, in modern societies, all things, even in the military department of affairs, are decided not by individual effort, but by the combined operations of numbers, while the main occupation of society has changed from fighting to business and from military to industrial life. And this is part of his rationale for making this change, is that, we now live in a society where the majority, where the collective acts, in industry, in the military, in politics with democracy, with more and more democracy. And so, we cannot step back from that and say, but in this particular case, we're going to rely on the individual entirely, to supply the motivation to behave well in this one area, whereas we're going to regulate and we're going to legislate in all other areas. So we become different through this process, and so the responsibility needs to be a collective responsibility. Okay, so that's part of his argument. And he's very skeptical that on their own, that men will consistently adhere to this. Maybe particularly because now everything is collective and everything is about the majority, right? Okay, so at the bottom of 697, he goes on to say, modern society is able to repress wrong through all departments of life by a fit exertion of the superior strength which civilization has given it. The numbers again give it the superior strength over the individual, and thus to render the existence of the weaker members of society tolerable, no longer defenseless but protected by law, tolerable to them without reliance on the chivalrous feelings of those who are in a position to tyrannize, which I believe is misspelled. The beauties and graces of the chivalrous character are still what they were. Okay, so maybe that's a little nod to the fact that if they're still practiced, he's not against that. But the rights of the weak and the general comfort of human life now rest on a far surer and steadier support, or rather they do so in every relation of life except the conjugal. So he wants to apply it to marriage. So what do you think of this argument? Is he right that if and we did move in that direction, that legal protections will keep women safe, or will keep women being treated well in their marriages? Has that worked better? Was he right about that? I think that's an open question, isn't it?
It works better, but it still doesn't work to the extent that he probably wants it to, because there's still spousal abuse.
Mm-hmm.
There's still issues that we have even today.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a complete and total fix, but I think it's better than just the trying to rely on men being nice.
Yeah, which
just
is
on their own.
Uh-huh.
I think to get what he wants, it'd be very tough, because to me it seems like he'd need elements of both the legal protection and the chivalry.
Mm-hmm.
And that would just, I think, confuse people.
Mm-hmm. And what we've got now is we've got the dropping away of the chivalry or the moral obligation, the feeling of sort of, because of equality, okay, because of equality, it's difficult to tell a man, okay, in this one area for this one specific reason, you are more responsible. It's just difficult to say that. We don't want to say that. And yet we do still have more women than men are victims of domestic battery and of rape and of all kinds of crimes like that. So this is something that I'm trying to tackle in my research. Actually, is how do you handle that in a highly egalitarian society where nobody wants to say men are different than women, and therefore they still have they need to get this message, without basically saying men are better than women, which nobody wants to say.
I think part of it kind of confuses the issue, because in this egalitarian situation, ironically, you're pitting men against women by saying it's your responsibility, and then on the other hand, we have slut shaming. So by women, by men,
Yes.
against women. So it's kind of we're better off, but the better off bar is still really, really low.
Mhm.
Wherein a lot of women, okay, yeah, I can go to the law, but do I really want to?
Right, yeah.
So the worst thing of my life, am I going to just lay it all out?
Put it out there, yeah, yeah.
I guess on a situational basis, I can't remember what class we had this in, but I think we talked about it before. And it's if you're a woman and you see another woman being attacked by a man that is twice your size, just somewhere on the streets and nobody else is helping, what do you do?
Mhm.
Do you run up there and try to fend the guy off even though he's twice your size and you're probably going to get hurt? Or do you try to bring a man to do it because he's that size? And I mean,
Right.
yes, there's a big difference between men and women, like especially in strength and size.
Mhm.
And nothing is ever going to change that fact. But I mean, in our society, it's, I don't know, I guess from when I was little, it's always been taught, you treat everybody nice. It doesn't matter if they're a man or a woman. It doesn't matter, like,
Mhm.
you hold doors open for everybody. You don't just,
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if people are weaker, they're weaker. I mean, if a man's weaker than I am, I'm going to try to protect him.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter
It could be applied.
the sex.
Yeah, by just simple strength or particular abilities regardless of gender.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, in that scenario, I guess I'd be more likely to go try to find a man if I possibly could, actually. But have you noticed that in our movies and television shows, that women are depicted as being able to kick people's butts on a regular basis now? Have you
It's
noticed
like two
that?
sides of it, because there's that, but then you'll see things and the woman will just, because I've been noticing this lately, she'll just back off. Like, why aren't you getting it? Like, you can throw stuff and distract the person, and
Oh,
they'll
so
just
yes,
kind of like
yes.
stand by and wait.
I mean, it really depends. Like, I do taekwondo and like I do fight. Like
Mhm.
that's part of it. And so like, you know, even if a guy is twice your size, he's got size on you and he probably has speed on you too. So I mean, like,
Right.
even if you are trained, that's not a realistic thing to go against.
Yeah,
who's
it'd
twice
be a
your
last
size.
ditch, I mean, if you have to, but it wouldn't be something that you'd want to do.
Yeah, no. So I mean, even if women are, you know, trained to fight, it's still a disadvantage. Like,
Mhm.
there's no way of getting around the physical disadvantage. You can lift weights and practice all you want, but it's just
Yeah.
part of it.
With all of that, you're about equal to a man that doesn't do any of that.
Yeah.
If you constantly train, you're equal to a guy who sits on a couch all day long. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. Unfortunately, it's just it's biological or whatever. But our media, and I think it's because of how. And I agree with you. There's like two different images of women in our media right now. Either victims that are like, eek, you know, help, or they're just like Rambo. And neither one of those are realistic.
And kind of what I'm seeing though is not only have they shown physical victory, but in shows that I've watched, women have won, like, I don't know how to say it, like mental victories, like they've outsmarted
Mm-hmm.
other men. I've seen a lot of that lately.
Yeah,
In a lot of
me too.
shows.
You're right, yeah. So there's I think it's a concerted effort to change the way people think about women. I mean, that there's a lot of political and social messages that come through our media, our TV, and our
I mean, I think a
movies.
good example is Claire Underwood.
Oh,
in
yeah, right.
House of Cards.
In
She's-
House of Cards.
Yeah.
hmm And I was thinking of Emily Thorne in Revenge, if you've ever watched Revenge. She is a master of the martial arts, and she can pretty much, she's depicted as, she's this little itty bitty woman, but she can just murder any guy.
I don't know
and
how
it's just
far.
unrealistic.
I don't know how far you guys are in Game of Thrones, but whenever you meet Brienne of Tarth,
Yeah.
she is like the perfect example of
The
that.
female,
Okay. Like-
she's,
well, it's really interesting with her because she's a female knight and it was not very popular
Uh-huh.
during that time.
but she's huge. Like, she's like, she's depicted as being like 6'5" and
Well, at
Yeah.
least that's realistic.
200 or
Yeah.
something pounds. It's
Okay, I
like,
can
that is
believe
realistic.
that.
I can believe a huge man-sized woman beating
Sure.
the crap out of a man.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah,
I can
like,
picture that.
like she took 3 people on in one scene by herself. It was incredible.
Is it actually a woman?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay.
She's actually
Yeah.
She is a woman.
female. Yeah, she's just a large female, and I
Yeah.
mean,
Mhm. Well, video games do that too. Video games regulate. I mean, you can go into any avatar you want, and you can do whatever you want. So I think that's where it might have started.
Yeah.
But I think it sets up unrealistic expectations for what women are going to be able to do under real life circumstances.
Well, what you don't really see is men and women working together.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah.
let me assist you while you beat the crap out of that guy in the defend
That's
this
true.
person.
No, you don't. Yeah, it's worth
That's
thinking about
interesting.
what messages we're getting, from what we watch and what expectations that sets up. But it's a part of the desire that we have. I mean, very deeply ingrained desire, especially in this country, for full and complete equality. And our media is always way ahead of actual societal practice, in every area. So, but I mean, I have on this sheet here pro and con. That's not from Mill. That's from me. And I was basically thinking of
Is this pro and con for chivalry?
for the legal sanctions,
Okay,
actually,
okay,
for
okay.
going with the law rather than chivalry. I was thinking of Edmund Burke and his discussion of chivalry and the whole, his critique of the French Revolution. He basically said that if law replaces moral responsibility, especially between men and women, that you will get a lowering of actual caring between the two. That you will get less care and more of a sort of contractual sense of marriage and relationships, and that this is a thing that makes us human, this idea we have moral responsibility in caring for other people. It's drawn out the most, he thinks, in relationships between men and women because of the love between them, but it spills over into other areas of life. So if you lose it there, you're likely to see other human beings and other relationships as likewise contractual or about self-interest and not about sort of extending yourself to the other person. But on the other side, and this is Mill's side, since you can't rely on genuine morality, you can't rely on it consistently. It's too much to ask somebody to rely on it, And he would say, for instance, okay, are we going to ask the businessman to forego contract law and rely upon, the honesty and decency and sense of obligation of his business partners? No.
Look at small business owners, though, and maybe I have no proof to back this up. Maybe it's just a stereotype, but versus MNCs and major corporations,
Uh-huh.
who is more entrenched in contract law problems? The
bigger
MNCs,
ones.
The
Yeah.
small business, okay, I practice fair, whatever business.
And that's true. Yeah.
What's going on?
I feel like a large part of that's because the small businesses have a smaller, they've got a smaller customer base, and so it's if it gets out that they're having, they're practicing, just not being, I guess, polite in the business world. I don't know how to put that.
Dishonest or
Then
whatever, yeah.
their customer base is probably going to shrink a lot worse than, say, a multinational corporation where thousands and thousands, millions of people
Mm-hmm.
participate in, whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah. And that's and one could argue that mechanism is actually more effective than the law, because even though we have the law, there's always somebody trying to get around the law, right? Same thing with spousal abuse and all of that. I mean, though we have the laws, there's plenty of people who still don't behave well, and there's plenty of women who don't avail themselves of the law. And so without that sense of shame, and this is what you're talking about with business, and again, I'm working on this, so sorry if I'm pontificating, but the honor-shame mechanism, is a very old and tried and true method of controlling people's behavior, because we do care what other people think. And so the businessman thinks twice at the local level, because he sees all these people all in church or in the synagogue or in the business association, the Rotary, whatever. He sees these people and he knows they're going to be talking about him and his bad behavior if he does it. So he thinks twice, or he should, and if he doesn't, he does. This happens to people, I know I let people know if I feel like I've been treated badly by a local merchant. And they will lose a lot, so they regulate themselves without even thinking about the law. And certainly in relationships between men and women, the same thing could apply. But we have this very heavy emphasis on privacy in marital and romantic relationships, okay, where where people say it's none of my business, and where, like you mentioned, women won't report things because they're embarrassed. Well, they also won't report things to their friends, to their, to the friends and family of their husbands or their boyfriends for the same reason. But if we could remove that overemphasis, I believe overemphasis on privacy, and basically allow people to see what's going on, and for people to be, concerned about their reputation, that in of itself might be a more powerful regulator of people's behavior than simply the law. But the liberal system emphasizes privacy, particularly in matters of personal sexual behavior and religion. In those two areas, and religion is probably a good thing, but I'm not so sure about personal relationship behavior, if it is. And so there's no, shaming doesn't work in that area very well, okay? Burke, I think, definitely preferred that method and believed in that method. But okay, to play devil's advocate, the bad side of that is if a person is shamed, there's, especially in a smaller community, there's very little chance of recovery. So there's very little ability for that person to reform and to move on, because that memory is kind of forever tarnishes that person. So people will say, well, then you don't get a chance to improve or to change. We're not giving people that chance. We're sort of blackening their reputation permanently.
But you could shame like via restorative justice, like hurt model. But it's like, I think the example in this restorative justice class I took once used these this older couple, and like they had like a trailer or something. These kids like broke into their trailer and like stole some stuff, and they caught them.
Okay.
They didn't take them to the police. They said, you're just gonna come have like dinner with us every night. And these kids had been like in and out of the law, and talking to them, they like totally reformed them. And I mean, it was probably pretty shameful to have to go over and face the people into whose trailer you broke every night.
Yes.
But they didn't get in trouble with the law after that.
Yeah, that's a great idea, very effective. I've heard of judges doing not that, but making a person wear a shirt that says, I did whatever, or having to go publicly apologize to somebody so that you make it known, what you did. And
I think the best recent example is that kid that got caught riding by his mom in Baltimore.
Oh yeah, that's
and
right.
got
Yes.
butt kicked on national TV, and then
yeah.
oh god, what's the guy from 60 Minutes?
Mike Wallace, or is he
Anderson
now?
Cooper.
Anderson
No,
Cooper.
Anderson Cooper.
365
They
or
went.
something like
They
that.
went and they went and interviewed him.
I think he's like #1, isn't he, Cooper? Or he's
Yeah.
pretty big, so a lot of people
He's
watch
pretty-
that.
Yeah. No, this kid was riding in Baltimore, and apparently his mom passed him on the street and saw him and noticed it was him, and she whooped his
She
butt.
just like ran right in there, grabbed his collar and yanked him right
and
out
was
and
like
kicked him.
smacking him, and oh my gosh, it was hilarious.
So it was all on TV, and I saw them on CNN. She and her kid went on CNN too. It was a different one. It wasn't Anderson Cooper. It was some woman that was interviewing them. She was there, and she didn't make any bones about it, that he was completely wrong. She didn't raise him that way. And he's sitting there, and to his credit, he basically said, yeah, she was right. I shouldn't have been there, So he was standing by her. Learned a very valuable lesson there. That's his claim to fame. But if more people did that kind of thing with their kids, the world would be a better place. I mean, no black man that's decent at all is gonna attack some mother that's going in to grab her son. I think that the black community is actually more respectful of mothers than white people, I think. And I thought, I bet she felt fairly safe, because a black man would be ashamed to attack somebody's mother, I mean, I'm not saying she was totally safe, but I could see how she could think that she could wade in there and do that.
Actually, a lot of black comedians talk about that, the difference between like how like they treat their parents versus how like their white friends treat their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's like so true. Like, how are you saying that to your mom? Like, are you serious? That you're like butt kicked? Like
That's because mom is the parent in a lot of households. I mean, mom is the mom and dad in a lot of their households, and she rules. You know, it's a little bit matriarchal, and yeah. So I mean, you just don't do that. I could well imagine I bet nobody touched her. And I bet everybody stood back. I didn't actually see the video. I heard about it because I don't have cable. But
It was hilarious.
I doubt if anybody tried to pull her off of him, or did you see it?
Yeah, it was like pretty much like he wasn't like with a huge group of people, but he was just kind of like there on his own. He was kind of on the fringes of whatever else was going on in the background. And she just like turned over, saw him, and was just like immediately ran over there and started beating his butt. It was hilarious. Everybody just like, we're gonna go over here.
That's what I would have wanted to do, you know. Yeah. I mean,
man,
your
it was-
first instinct would be to just grab him and just, you know, I mean, no matter how big they get, they're still your kid. And yeah.
That was hilarious. That was probably the best parenting I've seen in a while.
Yeah. Yeah, she's a role model for a lot of other people. I hope they pay attention to that. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about the overemphasis of religion. Here, you know, the typical view was that women were the guardians of religion, that they were kind of the paragons in this area. They served a role in sort of more or less coercing their men to make sure they were churchgoers and kind of stayed in line with prayer and the Bible and so forth. And so Mill tries to expose the underside of this situation of women being this much in control of religion. He says, first of all, women are very fond of proselytizing, which means to spread the good news everywhere. And they especially support overseas proselytizing, which is missions. You know, they like to give money and raise money to send Christian missionaries overseas. But Mill is going against the tide here of his time in pointing out that those missions can be rather forceful, or they can be an imposition upon the people in these other countries that creates animosities between his country and theirs, right? Or actually can create a situation where there's religious divisions within these countries, which can cause conflict. Okay, so, and in any case, he says, when people go and they try to convert people in this manner, they don't necessarily get any genuine conversions. They get conversions based on feeling coerced or some sort of bribery. You know, we'll help you with this, that, and the other thing if you convert. So this is a dubious distinction that women promote missions and that women promote the spreading of Christianity in this way. Also, and this may surprise you or may have surprised you, women, of course, were very active in church charities. You know, this was one area where they could have some social impact. So they would form these charities and they would be involved in raising money for people in their cities and towns. And he says too much charity in this mothering kind of fashion can create dependency. And so this is not necessarily good either. Isn't that interesting?
I don't know how Mill would feel about welfare then.
I don't know if he would
Probably
like
wouldn't it.
Yeah.
No, I don't.
The current system, anyways.
Right. I don't think he was against. I know he wasn't against welfare generally, but he definitely would want welfare to be set up in a way to not discourage work. Okay. And what he's saying about women's charities is that they're all just about giving people handouts and just taking care of them, but not giving them the hand up, so to speak, of encouraging them to work or giving them training and things like that.
So I took that in the totally wrong direction when I read it because I thought of Afghanistan.
Well, you have to elaborate.
So like how we've gone in and I mean obviously we're not taking care of things, we're just kind of like ruining them. But the idea was that we're gonna, you know, with the whole crusade, you go in and give them democracy
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of stuff. That, or like when we went into Iraq, the pretend goals of like, you know, giving them democracy, getting Saddam out,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And then we just kind of stayed, and we're still there, and now we can't really leave because of what happened last time, and they're just too dependent.
They're
on us.
too dependent, yeah, yeah. We tried in other words, I mean, and maybe one could argue we haven't tried enough, although, or it might just be impossible. We've tried to transfer this, we've tried to train them, we've tried to give them schools, we've tried to make sure that women are able to vote and et cetera, but none of it seems to be sticking, right? And we've got a new major problem to deal with that has emerged surprisingly. And so you're right, it seems like we can't get out, but in this case, I mean, he's talking about charity that doesn't try, you know. I mean, the better charities provide, for instance, he proposes public education. Now that would have been seen by people at the time as a charitable or social welfare program, because most people's kids couldn't get an education, rather than having a soup kitchen where people can come daily and just get something to eat and then go back and still not be able to work well. But yeah, I mean, dependency isn't good for people, and this is what, you know, maybe he's going too far here. One could argue that this charity doesn't necessarily discourage people from bettering themselves, because who wants to stay at the subsistence level of just getting your meals at a church soup kitchen? Not that many people, probably. But I think that he's trying his best to show that the things that people generally see as positive roles for women are actually negative. They pour so much energy into this, and this can distort people's incentive structure, is what he's saying. They're creating a distorted incentive structure. They're treating adult people like children, okay? All right. So yes, it's not necessarily fair. We do a combination of all that today, right? I mean, we have programs, we have private charities that do nothing but give people things that they need, clothes, food, etc. We have private charities that go well beyond that to give them training, try to get them into jobs. We have public social welfare programs that do both of those things as well. Okay. So, you know, we have both, and I'm not sure how correct he is, I guess I would say, about, you know, the lack of value in the handout type of charity. It is a Christian, you know, the Christian religion says it's part of a Christian's duty is to supply the things that people don't have that they need, without asking for something in return, or without expecting work in return and that kind of thing. So, but he doesn't deal with that. Okay, another problem that he points out is this motivating function that men thinking of chivalry would have considered a positive role for women is not necessarily a positive role. He gets back into this manipulative quality of women. They have to pour all of their energy into their husband's behavior, but if they don't have any experience with men's life and how they live it, what it's like to have a job, what it's like to get higher education, then how do they really know how to motivate men constructively? Okay, if women are more concerned about their status and how they can gain their status through their men and how their men make them look, then they may actually stop men from doing things that would benefit society by saying, oh, you better not do that, that's not going to look good. You better not do that, that won't provide a stable income, and then we will lose status. That might keep men from taking chances, and that's the kind of thing that, previously, remember he said men tend to be more theoretical. Well, the theoretical mind isn't necessarily the practical mind, but it's more likely to take chances, and people like that can make great strides. But what if their wife is concerned, like Socrates' wife, why don't you make some money, for goodness sakes? Well, what if Socrates had listened to Xanthopy, and started to try to make money rather than, be an itinerant philosopher? We wouldn't have the Western tradition, right? So the implication is that women who are educated and who have some experience with the workplace would be able to understand and motivate their husbands more in ways that would benefit society more, and they wouldn't be so concerned about just mere appearances. Okay? What do you think about that? I mean, is that a good argument? Is it a relevant argument?
I would say yes. I mean, I think that if you marry somebody, you should be on the same side as them. You shouldn't be dragging somebody down or, because of that, losing that motivation. But I think it goes for both sides too, not just the wife.
Yeah, at this point it would.
Yeah.
Right. You should support them and whatever it is that they want to do,
yeah.
right? Yeah. And so what he sees is women saying, I think that you should stick with this job, rather than going for this private business, because the job is a steady income that we rely on. And who knows, you might fail at this business and then we'd be drugged down, rather than saying, hey, this is your dream, go for it. Because I can also help, bring in income. I can also help make sure that,
Well, that's a pretty common, current day problem. Even if the wife is educated, she's not always going to agree with the husband. You see that now, obviously.
A lot, yes.
Especially with you want to start a business. In today's economy, that's not a very smart decision. Even if it is your dream, if you're probably going to crash and burn at it, it's probably not a good idea to do that.
Right.
Say now, as opposed to, the wife saying, why don't you wait a few years and, wait until we've saved up the money and, wait until, maybe the economy gets better, we find a better place to live, a place that'll stimulate the, business better.
Right.
So, if she's educated, she's not necessarily going to agree with him always, and he's not going to agree with her always. It's just part of marriage. But, there would be, I guess, more reasoning put into the reasons why they wouldn't agree.
Yeah. You brought up in a way the objection that I have here at the end, which is that if Mill is right about men and women being different on average in, the theoretical versus the practical, and women being more attuned to the needs of people and the family and the practical matters, then even if they became more educated, they'd be more likely to say, well, let's think about the practicalities here. Let's think about the impact on our kids. Let's think about, what other people might think, because these are things that women might be more attuned to. And you do still see that. And it does tend to be, this is a very unscientific thing we're talking about here, because I don't think I've seen any studies on this, but when you listen to talk shows, where they deal with relationships, it's frequently the woman who's calling up saying, my husband wants to sell, the house and move to whatever, or my husband wants to, invest our savings in this, and I'm uncomfortable with that. And a lot of times it has to do with the kids, what will happen to the kids? Oh, we have to move, and they're in junior high. Should we move, or should we stay? Because they are thinking more of the family and the longer term, prospects and whatnot. That's not necessarily supportive. I'm not saying that's good to be that way, but I've certainly still seen it. It's not like it's a thing of the past necessarily. Women are not maybe on average as great a risk takers, wouldn't you say? For
on
really
average,
good reasons.
It seems like they step back and analyze the situation better. They
Which, I
just
mean,
jump right into something.
Back then,
Right.
I feel like he probably could have taken a different route with this argument and said, you know, educated women would understand what motivates men and would understand, you know, the whole sacrificing comfort, status, life, and whatnot. But they will look at it in a different way that will make sure that men aren't making the wrong choice. Because he doesn't ever say this, but men, I'm sure, made very stupid choices back then.
Sure, just like anybody.
So I mean, like, it would be like having a second consciousness go over a decision before you make a big life decision.
Which he elsewhere says is a good thing, that the strengths they complement each other. He doesn't say that here. I mean, one of the weaknesses of the utilitarian approach to a subject is that it does tend to, there's some vacillation. In other words, it depends on what you're arguing at the time more. There's less of a focus on consistent principle. You know, at this point, he's arguing, you know, men would not be drugged down, which is a very appealing thing to men men are like, oh, that'd be nice. I wouldn't have to listen to my wife, you know, telling me to stop all the time, right, and not do that. But elsewhere, he does seem to contradict himself, saying, you know, this is a benefit to combine these two types of thinking. So, okay. Well, I guess we're out of time. But,